So in today's lesson, we're going to learn about the fast carbon cycle. This is continuing on from what we did last lesson about the slow carbon cycle, which is part of the OCR A-level geography spec, where you need to know about carbon cycling between the land, oceans, and the atmosphere. So the carbon cycle, in terms of the fast carbon cycle, the obvious word that's changed is the fact that it's fast. And therefore we've got carbon moving rapidly between the atmosphere, the ocean, the soils, and all the kind of living organisms, both in the biosphere and the hydrosphere, so on the land and in the oceans. And it's up to 1,000 times quicker than the slow carbon cycle. 10 to 1,000 is the estimation, but we can see that this is obviously a lot quicker. The processes that are happening are taking not millions of years to happen, but sometimes they're taking hours, days, weeks. I'm going to start with the oceans and to talk about how the surface oceans are really important in terms of the fast carbon cycle. So we talked before at the start of the slow carbon cycle about this process called diffusion, where it's that interchange of gases between the ocean and the atmosphere. And so carbon dioxide moves from the atmosphere into the ocean in this process of diffusion. So the surface ocean gains a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This process is a two-way exchange though, and therefore some carbon dioxide which is created in the ocean actually gets leaked out of the ocean back into the atmosphere. So we need to know that there is this continuing flux between the atmosphere and the surface ocean in terms of gas exchange. There is also another way in which the surface ocean has a influence on the fast carbon cycle. So in the surface ocean, there are these microscopic plant organisms that look like what I've shown in this picture here, and they float around in the surface ocean. So they're a bit like kind of sea creatures, but they're more like plants. And that the fact that they're more like plants is really important. And they're called phytoplankton. And what they do is they use that dissolved carbon that's in that surface ocean, and they combine it with sunlight to photosynthesize. So that sunlight's gone through into the top of the ocean, and they use that along with the water and the sunlight and the dissolved carbon to photosynthesize. So essentially, you can think of these as like little plants in the sea. They use this carbon for two things. The obvious thing is that they use it to build their cells, so to actually build their structures, and also to make food for themselves. And the moving food is part of the kind of next key process in which they're involved in. Because they make food, they obviously then use energy. And when they respire, they release carbon back into that surface ocean. And then some of that, not all of it, but some of it will be released back into the atmosphere. So again, we've got inputs and outputs of carbon, in this surface ocean. We can actually see this phenomenon of phytoplankton from a satellite. So this is near Norway, and we can see this green area here. This is actually that kind of phytoplankton. That's what it looks like. It's like an algae bloom almost, it looks like. And we can see that in certain parts of the world, there will be these huge blooms. But it doesn't happen all year round. This is a graph, a map of the world showing us the amount of kind of primary productivity. So where we actually get growth, either on land and the oceans. It's just showing the oceans in these graphs. On the picture on the left, I can see that in the northern hemisphere, in April and May, there's this massive green patch, which shows us that there is lots of kind of growth in the oceans at that point. This tells me that the blooms only occur when there is enough sunlight. So I need sunlight for this photosynthesis process to happen. And I can see that by looking on the picture on the right in November and December, which is in winter time in the Northern Hemisphere. And there is much less, because we've got much less sunlight at that point of the year in terms of the intensity of sunlight. And therefore, because we've got less solar radiation, we get less photosynthesis because those phytoplankton haven't got what they need to grow. Phytoplankton are in the ocean, but we've got very similar processes happening in the biosphere on the land. So trees act in a very similar way. They absorb carbon from the atmosphere via the process of photosynthesis for food. They also respire by using that energy. And carbon is actually stored, in the matter. So it's stored in the trunk and the branches, the leaves and the roots, as what we call kind of organic carbon or a carbon compound. That carbon that's in the tree doesn't just stay there though, and it actually will pass from the tree. In this example, it's they've made some nuts, which are kind of like the fruit of the tree, which are eaten by a squirrel, which gets eaten by a fox, and then that gets eaten by a wolf. So we can see that carbon actually gets passed down the food chain from plants all the way down the chain to animals, but also humans. So if I eat a potato from the ground, that potato is part of that plant and therefore is a carbon-based life form. We can also see from this diagram that with all of these animals that they are respiring as well. So respiration happens not just in plants, but in animals and humans. So we're releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere. Last kind of major thing to discuss in the fast carbon cycle is when these organisms, whether it is a plant like a tree here or an animal, when they die, decomposers, which we call like fungi and bacteria, they then break these down, and they break this down via the process of decomposition, and this releases carbon in two ways. It releases CO2 into the atmosphere, which is where most of the carbon goes, but also because it's breaking down that matter, some of that carbon compound goes back into the soil, gets recycled and used by other plants and animals in the system.